The dust settled on the train platform as the last whistle of the day echoed through the valley, leaving behind a silence that felt almost eerie in the small town of Silver Creek, Arizona. Willow Warner clutched her swollen belly, her vision blurring as the late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on her pale face. She had traveled for 3 days straight, fleeing a past that haunted her every waking moment, hoping to find refuge in this frontier town where no one knew her name. But her strength had finally abandoned her, just like everything else in her life. Xavier Zachary pulled his hat lower over his eyes as he led his stallion away from the livery stable. The scent of trouble was in the air. He could always sense it, like a storm brewing on the horizon. 6 years as a ranch hand and occasional deputy had taught him that. It was 1885, and the West was becoming less wild by the day, but danger still lurked in the shadows of progress. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the train station, intending to check if any mail had arrived for the Double R Ranch. That's when he saw her, a slender figure in a dusty blue dress, one hand braced against a post, the other protectively curved around her belly. "Miss." Xavier called out, quickening his pace. Willow heard the deep voice as if through water, distant and muffled. She tried to turn toward it, but her knees buckled beneath her. The world tilted sideways as she collapsed onto the wooden steps of the station. Xavier sprinted the remaining distance, reaching her just as she crumpled to the ground. He knelt beside her, noting her ashen complexion and the fine beads of sweat dotting her brow. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, falling around a face that, despite its current distress, held a gentle beauty that caught him off guard. "Madam, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Xavier glanced around the empty platform. The station master had already closed up for the evening, and there wasn't another soul in sight. Without hesitation, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other around her shoulders, carefully lifting her against his chest. Her body felt fragile yet warm against him, and he could feel the slight swell of her belly pressed against his ribs. "I've got you," he murmured, straightening to his full height. Xavier carried her across the dusty main street, ignoring the curious glances from the few townsfolk still out at that hour. The local doctor's office was at the far end of town, and he wasn't certain the woman would stay conscious that long. Instead, he headed for Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, just a stone's throw from where they were. As he climbed the 3 steps to the porch, Willow stirred in his arms, her eyes opening partially. Confusion and fear flashed across her face, and she weakly attempted to push away from him. "You're safe," Xavier said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm taking you somewhere you can rest." Something in his steady gaze must have reassured her, for she ceased her struggle, allowing her head to rest against his shoulder once more. "Mrs. Holloway," a stout woman with a perpetual look of concern etched into her face, opened the door before Xavier could even knock. Her eyes widened at the sight before her. "Good heavens, Xavier. What's happened?" "Found her collapsed at the station, Mrs. Holloway. She needs help. She's with child." The older woman's demeanor shifted immediately from surprise to decisive action. "Bring her to the blue room downstairs. I'll fetch some water and send Billy for the doctor." Xavier followed Mrs. Holloway through the tidy parlor and into a small bedroom off the main hallway. He gently laid Willow on the quilted bed, taking care to support her head until it rested on the pillow. "The doctor will be here soon," he told her, his voice softer than he'd intended. "You're going to be all right." Willow's eyes opened fully this time, revealing irises the color of summer sage. "My bag," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "At the station." "I'll get it," Xavier promised, straightening up. He turned to Mrs. Holloway, who had returned with a basin of water and some clean cloths. "Take care of her, I'll be back shortly." Xavier strode back to the station, scanning the platform until he spotted a modest carpet bag resting against the post where Willow had been standing. As he picked it up, he was struck by how light it was, hardly enough belongings for a woman about to have a child. It raised questions, but Xavier had learned long ago not to pry into other people's stories unless invited. When he returned to the boarding house, Dr. Thompson had already arrived. The elderly physician emerged from the blue room just as Xavier entered the front door. "How is she?" Xavier asked, setting the bag down in the hallway. "Exhausted, dehydrated, and malnourished," the doctor replied, his voice grave. "But the baby seems strong. She needs rest, proper food, and time to regain her strength. I'd say she's about 7 months along, maybe a bit more." Xavier nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. "Has she said anything about where she came from, or where she's headed?" "Not a word beyond her name, Willow Warner. Mrs. Holloway is sitting with her now." The doctor eyed Xavier curiously. "You did right by bringing her here, Zachary." "Not everyone would have bothered." Xavier shrugged off the compliment. "Anyone would have done the same." But as he stepped outside into the gathering dusk, Xavier knew that wasn't entirely true. Silver Creek had its share of kind souls, but also those who would look the other way when faced with another's troubles. He wasn't sure what had compelled him to help the woman Willow beyond basic decency, but something about her vulnerability had stirred something protective in him. He mounted his horse and headed back to the Double R Ranch, where he worked as the foreman. The ranch owner, Robert Russell, would be wondering what had delayed him in town. As the sprawling property came into view, Xavier pushed thoughts of the mysterious pregnant woman aside. He had responsibilities here, and dwelling on a stranger's plight wouldn't help either of them. Yet, as he settled into his bunk that night after reporting to Russell, Xavier found himself wondering about Willow Warner. Where had she come from? Why was she traveling alone in her condition? And why did the fear in her eyes seem to run deeper than just the physical distress of her collapse? Morning came with the familiar sounds of the ranch awakening, men calling to one another, horses nickering, the cook banging pots in the kitchen. Xavier rose before dawn, as was his habit, and completed his morning chores with efficiency. By mid-morning, he found himself approaching Russell with a request that surprised even himself. "Need to head into town for a few hours, if that's all right," he said, trying to sound casual. "Want to check on that woman from yesterday, make sure she's recovering properly." Russell, a barrel-chested man with a salt and pepper beard, raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize you were in the habit of making social calls, Zachary." Xavier maintained a neutral expression. "Just being neighborly." "Won't take long." "Go on then," Russell replied with a dismissive wave. "But be back by afternoon. We've got that herd to move to the north pasture." The ride into Silver Creek took less than an hour. Xavier left his horse at the livery and walked to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, suddenly uncertain of his purpose there. What business was it of his how the woman fared? Yet his feet carried him forward until he stood on the tidy porch, hat in hand. Mrs. Holloway greeted him with a knowing smile. "I wondered if you might come by." "She's awake and has managed some breakfast." "Is she recovered enough for visitors?" Xavier asked, feeling uncharacteristically hesitant. "I believe a friendly face would do her good. She seems quite alone in the world." Mrs. Holloway led him to the blue room and knocked gently before opening the door. "Miss Warner, you have a visitor." Willow was sitting up in bed, a shawl draped around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. Her chestnut hair had been brushed and plaited, and some color had returned to her cheeks, but Xavier could still see the exhaustion lingering in her eyes. The gentleman who helped you yesterday has come to see how you're faring," Mrs. Holloway explained, ushering Xavier into the room. Willow's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "You carried me here," she said softly. Xavier nodded, suddenly aware of how large and out of place he felt in the dainty bedroom. "Xavier Zachary, madam. Wanted to make sure you and the little one were doing all right." A smile touched her lips, transforming her face in a way that made Xavier's chest tighten inexplicably. "Mr. Zachary, I owe you my deepest gratitude. The doctor says I might have been in serious trouble if I'd remained out in that heat much longer." "Just doing what needed doing," Xavier replied, shifting his weight. "And it's just Xavier, if you don't mind." Mrs. Holloway discreetly excused herself, leaving them alone. An awkward silence settled between them until Willow spoke again. "I haven't properly introduced myself. I'm Willow Warner." She hesitated, then added, "I came from St. Louis. I was hoping to reach my cousin in Tucson before the baby arrives." Xavier noted the careful way she offered this information, as if measuring each word. "That's quite a journey for a woman in your condition." Something flickered in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or something deeper. "I had my reasons for leaving when I did." "We all have our reasons for the journeys we take," Xavier replied, deciding not to press further. "When do you think you'll be continuing on to Tucson?" Willow's hands twisted in the bedsheet. "Dr. Thompson says I shouldn't travel for at least 2 weeks, and She faltered, a flush rising to her cheeks. "I'm afraid my funds are quite limited. I had just enough for the train fare." Understanding dawned on Xavier. She was stranded in Silver Creek with no money and a baby on the way. "Mrs. Holloway's a good woman. She won't turn you out." "I can't impose indefinitely," Willow said, a note of pride entering her voice. "I need to find work at least until I can save enough to continue my journey." Xavier considered this. Jobs for women in Silver Creek were limited, especially for one in her condition. Most households handled their own chores, and the saloon wasn't a suitable place for a respectable woman. "The general store might need help," he suggested. "Or perhaps the school could use an assistant teacher." "I was a teacher in St. Louis," Willow said, a genuine smile lighting her face for the first time. "Before." Her hand moved to her belly protectively. Xavier nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "Our schoolmistress, Miss Abernathy, has been complaining about her workload for months. I'll speak with her, see if she could use an extra pair of hands." "You would do that for me?" Willow asked, surprise evident in her voice. "This town takes care of its own," Xavier said simply. "And for now, that includes you." As he left the boarding house, Xavier couldn't explain the sense of purpose that had overtaken him. Perhaps it was just his innate need to solve problems, to fix what was broken. Or perhaps it was the vulnerability in those sage green eyes that had stirred something long dormant within him. Whatever the reason, Xavier found himself at the schoolhouse within the hour, speaking earnestly with Miss Abernathy about the qualified teacher currently recovering at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. By the time he returned to the ranch that afternoon, he had secured Willow a position as an assistant teacher, to begin as soon as Dr. Thompson declared her fit for light duties. Over the next few days, Xavier made a point to check on Willow whenever his duties brought him to town. Each visit revealed a woman growing stronger, both physically and in spirit. She spoke little of her past, and Xavier didn't ask, sensing that whatever had driven her to flee St. Louis while carrying a child was a wound still too fresh to probe. Instead, they talked about Silver Creek, about the children she would soon be teaching, about books they had both read, and about the vast, open beauty of the Arizona territory. Xavier found himself sharing stories of his own journeys from his childhood in Texas to his years driving cattle before settling at the Double R Ranch. He'd never been much for conversation, yet with Willow, words came easily. A week after her collapse at the station, Willow was well enough to take short walks around town, always accompanied by either Mrs. Holloway or, when he could manage it, Xavier. On one such walk, they paused at the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to the vast expanse of desert and mountain. "It's beautiful," Willow said, her face turned toward the setting sun. "So different from St. Louis. There's a freedom in all this space." Xavier watched her profile against the golden light. "Most folks find it intimidating at first, too empty." "Not empty," she corrected softly. "Just waiting, like a blank page." The image struck Xavier as fitting not just for the landscape but for Willow herself. Whatever she had left behind, she was clearly seeking a new beginning. "Your cousin in Tucson," he ventured carefully. "Are they expecting you?" A shadow crossed Willow's face. "My cousin Emma doesn't know I'm coming. We've not been in touch for some years, but she was always kind to me when we were girls. I'm hoping." She trailed off, her hand absently stroking her belly. "You're hoping she'll take you in," Xavier finished for her. Willow nodded, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "It was the only place I could think to go." Xavier wanted to ask about the baby's father, about what had driven her to such desperate measures, but he held his tongue. Instead, he said, "Silver Creek might not be as big as Tucson, but it's a decent place to start over." Willow turned to him then, a question in her eyes. "Are you suggesting I stay?" "Just pointing out options," Xavier replied, suddenly self-conscious. "Miss Abernathy is mighty pleased about having help at the school, and Mrs. Holloway says you're the best boarder she's had in years." A smile touched Willow's lips. "You've been discussing me with the townsfolk, Mr. Zachary?" "Just looking out for a friend," he said, surprised by how naturally the word friend had come to his lips. Willow's expression softened. "Is that what we are, friends?" "I'd like to think so," Xavier replied honestly. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower. Finally, Willow spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband died 6 months ago." Xavier turned to her, caught off guard by the sudden confession. "It was typhoid," she continued, her eyes still fixed on the distance. "We'd been married just over a year. He never even knew about the baby." Xavier remained silent, sensing she needed to speak without interruption. "After he died, I moved in with his brother and his wife. They were kind at first." Willow's voice hardened slightly. "Until I realized what Jonah, my brother-in-law, expected in return for that kindness." Xavier's jaw tightened, understanding all too well what she was implying. "Did he?" "No," Willow said quickly. "I left before it came to that." But he made it clear that was the arrangement he had in mind. Said it was my duty, as Henry's widow, to become his wife now. When I refused, things became difficult. His wife believed I was trying to seduce him. A bitter laugh escaped her. "As if I would want any man's hands on me after losing Henry." Xavier fought against the anger rising in him at the thought of what she'd endured. "So you ran." "I had to protect my child," Willow said simply, "and myself. I sold what few valuables I had left and bought a ticket as far west as my money would take me." "You're safe now," Xavier assured her, echoing the words he'd spoken when he first carried her from the station steps. Willow finally looked at him directly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "For how long, though? Once the baby comes, how will I manage alone?" "You're not alone," Xavier said firmly. "Not anymore." In that moment, standing in the fading light with Willow Warner, Xavier realized he meant every word. Whatever it took, he would ensure she and her child had the protection and security they deserved. As they walked back to the boarding house, a comfortable silence between them, Xavier found himself thinking of possibilities he hadn't considered in years. He'd been content with his solitary life, focused on his work and little else. But now, the thought of continuing that existence seemed somehow lacking. The next day brought an unexpected complication. Xavier had just finished mending a fence on the north edge of the Double R when he spotted a rider approaching from the direction of town. It was Billy, Mrs. Holloway's son, pushing his horse hard. "Mr. Zachary," the boy called out as he drew near. "Ma sent me to fetch you. There's a man in town asking questions about Miss Warner." Xavier's blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "Wanting to know if anyone matching her description has come through Silver Creek. Says he's her brother-in-law, looking to bring her home safely." Billy's young face was troubled. "Ma didn't like the look of him, so she sent me for you while she stalled him." Xavier was already mounting his horse. "You did right, Billy. Go on back and tell your ma I'm coming." The ride into town seemed interminable. Xavier's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If Willow's brother-in-law had tracked her this far, he was determined indeed and likely dangerous. By the time he reached Silver Creek, a small crowd had gathered outside the general store. At its center stood a well-dressed man with a carefully trimmed beard and the smug confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Jonah Warner, Xavier presumed, come to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. Xavier dismounted, moving through the onlookers until he stood face to face with the man. "You're looking for Willow Warner," he stated flatly. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are Xavier Zachary, foreman at the Double R Ranch." Xavier kept his voice level, though his every instinct screamed to put this man back on a train heading east. "Jonah Warner. My sister-in-law has run off in a delicate condition. Her mind is unbalanced since my brother's death. I've come to take her home where she can be properly cared for." "Is that so?" Xavier said, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Strange that a woman with an unbalanced mind managed to travel halfway across the country on her own. Jonah's pleasant facade slipped slightly. "I don't believe I asked for your opinion, Mr. Zachary. If you know where Willow is, I suggest you tell me now. She's carrying my brother's child, my nephew or niece. That makes the child my responsibility." "The way I see it," Xavier said, taking a step closer, "a woman has the right to decide for herself where she wants to be. Especially when she's fled clear across the country to get away from someone." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Jonah's face darkened with anger. "You're interfering in family matters you know nothing about." "I know enough," Xavier replied. "I know Willow Warner collapsed at our train station a week ago, exhausted and half-starved. I know she's terrified of returning to St. Louis. And I know that any man who would pursue a grieving widow across the country has motives that aren't about family responsibility." Jonah took a threatening step forward, but Xavier held his ground. "You have no legal right to keep her from me," Jonah hissed. "She's carrying a Warner heir." "She's carrying her child," Xavier corrected. "And in this town, we respect a woman's wishes." Sheriff Tom Riley pushed through the crowd, his weathered face set in grim lines. "What's all this about?" Jonah turned to the lawman, quickly reassuming his mask of concern. "Sheriff, I'm Jonah Warner from St. Louis. My sister-in-law has run away in a confused state. She's with child and not thinking clearly. I've come to bring her home where she belongs." Riley looked from Jonah to Xavier. "That true, Zachary?" "It's true that Miss Warner is here in Silver Creek," Xavier said carefully. "It's true she's expecting a child. But she's of sound mind and she left St. Louis deliberately." "I'd like to hear that from the lady herself," Riley decided. Xavier tensed. "She's still recovering from her journey. Dr. Thompson has advised rest." "Then we'll go to her," Riley said. "Mr. Warner, you'll wait here." "Zachary, you come with me." Xavier had no choice but to follow the sheriff toward Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, acutely aware of Jonah Warner's calculating gaze on his back. As they walked, he spoke urgently to Riley. "Sheriff, that man is dangerous. Willow fled St. Louis because he was forcing himself on her after her husband died." Riley's steps faltered slightly. "That's a serious accusation." "One I believe completely," Xavier said firmly. "You know me, Tom. I'm not given to dramatic tales or interfering in others' business. But this woman needs protection." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You've taken quite an interest in this young widow, haven't you?" Xavier didn't deny it. Someone needed to. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Holloway was waiting anxiously on the porch. "She knows he's here," she told them without preamble. "One of the neighbor ladies came running to warn her. She's packing her things now, saying she has to leave before he finds her." Xavier brushed past Mrs. Holloway and strode to the blue room, finding Willow frantically stuffing her meager belongings into her carpetbag. Her face was ashen, her hands trembling. "Willow," he said gently. She spun around, eyes wide with panic. "He found me. How did he find me?" "It doesn't matter," Xavier said, crossing the room to stand before her. "You don't have to run again." "You don't understand," Willow whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't know what he's capable of." "The sheriff wants to speak with you," Xavier told her. "If you tell him what you told me about why you left, he can make Warner leave town." Willow shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Jonah is a respected businessman in St. Louis. His word against mine. Who would believe me?" "I believe you," Xavier said simply. "And I think Sheriff Riley will too." Riley stepped into the room then, hat in hand. "Miss Warner, I'm Sheriff Tom Riley. There's a gentleman in town claiming to be your brother-in-law." Willow's hands went protectively to her belly. "Please, Sheriff, I can't go back to St. Louis with him. I just can't." "May I ask why not?" Riley's tone was gentle, but his eyes were sharp, assessing. Willow looked to Xavier, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she told the sheriff everything she had confided in Xavier about her husband's death, her brother-in-law's unwanted advances, and her desperate flight west. When she finished, Riley's expression was grave. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Warner. No one in my town will force a woman to go anywhere against her will, especially in your condition." Relief washed over Willow's face. "What will happen now?" "I'll have a word with Mr. Warner," Riley said. "Make it clear that you're under this town's protection. If he has any sense, he'll be on the next train east." After Riley left, Willow sank onto the edge of the bed, her strength seeming to leave her all at once. What if he doesn't leave? What if he stays in Silver Creek, waiting for a chance to force me back? Xavier sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Then we'll deal with that. But you should know, Willow, that Jonah Warner isn't the only one who can be stubborn." A small smile tugged at her lips despite her distress. "You've been nothing but kind to me, Xavier. Why?" It was a simple question, but Xavier found himself struggling to answer. Why had he taken such an interest in this woman's welfare? Why did the thought of her returning to St. Louis with her brother-in-law fill him with such dread? "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, though the words felt inadequate. "And because I think you deserve a chance at the kind of life you want." Willow studied his face as if searching for something hidden in his expression. "And what kind of life do you think I want?" "A safe one," Xavier replied. "One where you can raise your child in peace without fear, where you can teach if that's what you wish, where you can." He hesitated, then finished, "where you can find happiness again." Their eyes met, and in that moment, something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, that their connection had grown beyond simple neighborliness or even friendship. A knock at the door broke the silence. Mrs. Holloway entered, her face alight with satisfaction. "Sheriff Riley just sent word." That Warner fellow is booking passage on tomorrow morning's eastbound train. Seems the sheriff made it quite clear what would happen if he lingered in Silver Creek. Willow closed her eyes briefly, her relief palpable. "Thank you," she whispered. "All of you." Xavier stood, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment had become. "You should rest now. It's been a trying day." As he left the boarding house, Xavier felt lighter than he had in years. Willow was safe for now, at least, and would remain in Silver Creek. What that might mean for his own future, he wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. The following weeks saw a subtle but unmistakable change in the rhythm of Xavier's life. His trips to town, once sporadic and brief, became regular occurrences. The ranch hands exchanged knowing glances when he would ride out, freshly shaved and wearing his good shirt, ostensibly to check on things in town. Even Russell had taken to making sly comments about Xavier's newfound interest in civic matters. For her part, Willow thrived. Once Dr. Thompson deemed her strong enough, she began assisting at the schoolhouse 3 mornings a week. The children adored her, and Miss Abernathy declared her a godsend. She took her meals with Mrs. Holloway, gradually regaining the weight she had lost during her flight from St. Louis. And 3 evenings a week, when Xavier finished his duties at the ranch, they would walk together through Silver Creek or sit on Mrs. Holloway's porch, talking until the stars emerged in the vast Arizona sky. They spoke of books and ideas, of Willow's childhood in Kentucky before her family moved to St. Louis, of Xavier's years wandering the territories before finding a home at the Double R. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, content in each other's company. What they didn't discuss was the future specifically, what would happen after Willow's baby arrived. The unspoken question hung between them. Would she still seek out her cousin in Tucson? Or had Silver Creek become more than just a temporary haven? As Willow's time grew nearer, Xavier found himself increasingly preoccupied with these questions. He had never been a man to act impulsively. Yet each day that passed made the thought of Willow leaving more unbearable. It was Mrs. Holloway who finally broached the subject one evening as Xavier was leaving after one of his visits. "That young woman cares deeply for you, Xavier Zachary," she said, her tone matter of fact. "And unless I'm much mistaken, you feel the same." Xavier shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Holloway, I don't bother denying it," the older woman cut in. "I've got eyes in my head. Question is, what do you intend to do about it?" "She's still mourning her husband," Xavier pointed out, "and there's the baby to consider." "Life doesn't wait for perfect timing, Mrs. Holloway replied sagely. "And that child will need a father." The words echoed in Xavier's mind as he rode back to the ranch that night. Could he be a father to another man's child? Could he offer Willow the kind of life she deserved? And most importantly, did she want those things from him? The opportunity to find answers came sooner than expected. The following day, a telegram arrived at the ranch for Xavier. It was from Dr. Thompson. "Willow in labor, stop asking for you, stop come quickly stop." Xavier's heart hammered against his ribs as he saddled his horse with fumbling hands. He had known this day was coming, of course, but the reality of it sent a wave of fear and anticipation through him that he could hardly comprehend. "Everything all right?" Russell asked, watching Xavier's frantic preparations. "Willow, Miss Warner, she's having her baby," Xavier managed to say. "The doctor sent for me." Russell's eyebrows rose, but he merely nodded. "Go on then, we'll manage here." The ride to town passed in a blur. By the time Xavier reached Dr. Thompson's office, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the main street. Mrs. Holloway was waiting on the doctor's porch, her usually immaculate hair escaping its pins. "She's been at it for hours," Mrs. Holloway informed him, leading him inside. Dr. Thompson says the baby's positioned wrong. He's doing what he can, but... She trailed off, worry evident in her voice. Xavier felt a cold fear grip his heart. "Can I see her?" Mrs. Holloway hesitated. "It's not typically done having men present for such things." "Please," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "She asked for me." After a moment's consideration, Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Wait here. I'll speak with the doctor." Left alone in the small waiting room, Xavier paced restlessly. From somewhere within the building, he could hear muffled cries of pain that made his stomach clench. He had witnessed countless births on the ranch, calves, foals, even a litter of kittens in the barn last spring, but this was different. This was Willow. At last, Dr. Thompson emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. His face was grave but not despairing. "She's asking for you, Zachary." "It's not customary, but at this point." He shrugged. "A familiar face might give her strength, and she'll need all she can muster." Xavier followed the doctor down a short hallway to a room at the back of the building. The scene that greeted him nearly brought him to his knees. Willow lay on the bed, her hair darkened with sweat, her face contorted in pain. She seemed smaller somehow, more vulnerable than he had ever seen her. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise and relief. "Xavier," she gasped. "You came." He moved to her side, taking her hand in his. "Of course I came. The baby's turned wrong," she whispered between labored breaths. "Dr. Thompson says it's going to be difficult." "You're the strongest person I know, Willow Warner," Xavier told her firmly. "You and your child are going to be just fine." She gripped his hand with surprising force as another contraction seized her. "Will you stay?" she asked when it had passed, her voice small and uncertain. Xavier looked to Dr. Thompson, who gave a resigned nod. "I'll stay," Xavier promised. "Right here." What followed were the most harrowing hours of Xavier's life. He held Willow's hand through each contraction, wiped her brow with cool cloths provided by Mrs. Holloway, and murmured words of encouragement that he hoped masked his growing fear. Dr. Thompson worked tirelessly, his weathered hands gentle but insistent as he sought to turn the stubbornly positioned infant. As midnight approached, Willow's strength began to flag. Her grip on Xavier's hand weakened, and her cries became softer, more desperate. "She's losing too much blood, Doctor." Thompson murmured to Mrs. Holloway, his voice low but not low enough to escape Xavier's keen hearing. Terror gripped Xavier's heart. He leaned close to Willow, his mouth near her ear. "Listen to me, Willow. You need to fight for your baby, for..." He swallowed hard. "For us." Her eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with effort. "Us," she repeated weakly. "Yes, us," Xavier said, the words tumbling out before he could consider them. "I love you, Willow Warner. I think I have since I carried you off those station steps. So you need to fight now, because I'm not ready to lose you, not when I've just found you." A ghost of a smile touched her pale lips. "I love you too," she whispered. "I was afraid to say it, afraid you wouldn't want a woman with another man's child." "That child is part of you," Xavier said fiercely. "And I love every part of you." Something changed in Willow's expression, then a new determination, a gathering of strength from some hidden reserve. When the next contraction came, she bore down with renewed purpose, her eyes locked with Xavier's. "That's it," Dr. Thompson encouraged. "I can see the head now. One more push, Willow." With a cry that seemed to come from her very soul, Willow gave a final, mighty effort. There was a moment of suspended time, then the unmistakable sound of a newborn's indignant wail filled the room. "A boy," Dr. Thompson announced, his voice thick with emotion. "A strong, healthy boy." Tears streamed down Willow's face as the doctor placed the squalling infant on her chest. She looked up at Xavier, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the wonder of the moment. "Look what I made," she whispered. Xavier gazed down at the tiny, red-faced being and felt something break open inside him, a flood of love so powerful it left him breathless. "He's perfect," he managed to say, "just like his mother." In that moment, as dawn began to lighten the sky outside, Xavier knew with absolute certainty that this woman and this child were his future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would surely be many, they would face them together. The days that followed were a blur of joy and adjustment. Willow and her son, whom she named Henry after his father, remained under Dr. Thompson's care for a week before moving back to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house. Xavier divided his time between his duties at the ranch and visiting the new mother and child, bringing small gifts each time, a hand-carved wooden horse for when the boy was older, wildflowers picked along the way, a soft blanket purchased from the general store. Word spread quickly through Silver Creek about Xavier Zachary's devotion to the young widow and her infant son. Some eyebrows were raised. Of course, there would always be those who questioned the propriety of such an arrangement, but most viewed the developing relationship with approval. After all, Willow needed a protector, and Xavier had proven himself worthy of that role. 2 weeks after Henry's birth, Xavier arrived at the boarding house to find Willow sitting on the porch, the baby asleep in a cradle beside her. She looked up as he approached, her face lighting with a smile that made his heart race. "I was hoping you'd come today," she said, shifting to make room for him on the porch swing. Xavier sat beside her, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "How could I stay away?" he replied, his eyes moving to the tiny face nestled among blankets. "How is he today?" "Growing stronger by the hour," Willow said proudly. "Dr. Thompson says he's never seen a baby thrive so quickly." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching as the setting sun painted the western sky in hues of gold and crimson. Finally, Xavier cleared his throat. "Willow, there's something I need to ask you." She turned to him, her eyes curious. "What is it?" Xavier took her hand, marveling at how natural it felt to do so now. "I know it hasn't been long. I know you're still healing, both from Henry's birth and from everything that came before, but I can't bear the thought of you leaving Silver Creek." He paused, gathering his courage. "I want you to marry me." Willow's eyes widened. "Xavier, I know it's sudden," he rushed on, "and I know you had plans to go to Tucson to find your cousin. If that's still what you want, I'll understand, but I had to tell you how I feel. I love you, Willow. And I already love Henry as if he were my own." Tears welled in Willow's eyes. "I never thought I would find love again after Henry's father died. I never thought I would feel safe again after what happened with Jonah." "Is that a yes?" Xavier asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering directly, Willow leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening with a certainty that made Xavier's heart soar. When they parted, Willow's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. "Yes, Xavier Zachary, I will marry you." They were wed 2 months later in Silver Creek's small church. Mrs. Holloway insisted on hosting the reception at her boarding house, and it seemed the entire town turned out to celebrate. Even Russell, not known for his sentimentality, offered a gruff toast to the couple's happiness. As for living arrangements, Xavier had spent the weeks leading up to the wedding building a modest cabin on a piece of land he purchased at the edge of town, close enough for Willow to continue her teaching once Henry was a bit older, yet with enough space for a garden and perhaps, someday, more children. On their wedding night, after they had put Henry to sleep in the cradle Xavier had crafted with his own hands, husband and wife stood together on the porch of their new home, gazing out at the star-filled Arizona sky. "Are you happy?" Xavier asked, his arm around Willow's waist. She leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. happier than I ever thought possible." After a moment, she added, "Do you ever think about how our lives might have been different if I hadn't collapsed on those station steps that day?" Xavier considered this. "I try not to dwell on what might have been," he said finally. "But I do believe some things are meant to be. You were meant to come to Silver Creek. I was meant to find you." "My knight in dusty denim," Willow teased, turning in his embrace to face him. "Always," Xavier promised, lowering his mouth to hers. In the years that followed, their love only deepened. Henry grew into a strong, curious boy with his mother's sage-green eyes and a gentle spirit that endeared him to everyone in Silver Creek. When he was 3, a sister joined the family, Alina Rose, with her father's dark hair and determined nature. Willow continued teaching at the schoolhouse, becoming Miss Abernathy's successor when the older woman retired. Xavier eventually purchased the Double R Ranch when Russell decided to move back east to be near his grandchildren. The Zachary Ranch, as it came to be known, prospered under his careful management. Life on the frontier was never easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, times when money was scarce and worries plentiful. There was the year Henry fell ill with fever and they feared they might lose him. There were occasional whispers about Henry's parentage, though these were quickly silenced by the protective community that had embraced the Zachary family. Through it all, Xavier and Willow faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with each obstacle overcome. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, they would often sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge, marveling at the unexpected journey that had brought them together. "You ever regret it?" Willow asked one such evening, nearly a decade after their wedding. Taking in another man's son, building a life with a woman who came with so much baggage. Xavier looked at his wife, the years having only enhanced her beauty in his eyes. "Not for a single moment," he said truthfully. "You and Henry were the best things that ever happened to me. You gave me a family when I'd stopped believing I would ever have one. And you gave us a home when we needed it most," Willow replied, taking his weathered hand in hers. "You kept your promise that day at the station." "What promise was that?" Xavier asked. Though he already knew the answer, Willow smiled, her eyes reflecting the same love that had sustained them through the years. "You told me I was safe, and I have been every day since." As the stars continued their eternal dance overhead, Xavier Zachary held his wife close, grateful beyond words for the woman who had collapsed into his life that fateful day in Silver Creek. In a world often harsh and unforgiving, they had found in each other a sanctuary of love, trust, and unwavering commitment, a bond forged in desperate circumstances, but destined to endure for a lifetime. Henry eventually grew into a fine young man who took after both his birth father in his scholarly pursuits and Xavier in his steadfast character. By the time he turned 18, he had become an apprentice to Dr. Thompson, determined to follow a path of healing. Alina Rose, fiercely independent like both her parents, showed a natural affinity for working with horses and helped Xavier manage the expanding ranch operations. 2 more children joined the Zachary family over the years, twins James and Sarah, who brought new joy and challenges in equal measure. The little cabin at the edge of town had long since been expanded into a comfortable home filled with laughter, learning, and love. As Silver Creek grew from a frontier outpost into a proper town with a railway depot, telegraph office, and even a small library, established largely through Willow's tireless efforts, the Zacharys remained at its heart. They were fixtures at town meetings, church gatherings, and school functions, a family whose story had become woven into the very fabric of the community. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire town came together to celebrate. A grand party was held in the town square, with music, dancing, and tables laden with food. As the festivities wound down and evening approached, Xavier led Willow away from the crowd, back toward the train station where their story had begun. "Why are we coming here?" Willow asked, her hand warm in his. Xavier smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling with the gesture. "I wanted to remember where it all started, where I first saw the woman who would change my life forever." They stood together on the platform, now part of a proper station building rather than the simple wooden structure it had been 25 years earlier. The setting sun gilded the scene in golden light, not unlike that long-ago afternoon. "You were standing right there," Xavier said, pointing to a spot near the steps, "looking like you carried the weight of the world on your shoulders." Willow leaned against him, her body fitting perfectly against his side as it always had. "I did, in a way. I was so afraid, so alone." "Not anymore," Xavier murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple, her hair now streaked with silver that caught the fading light. "Not for a single day since you carried me off those steps," Willow agreed. "You know, I think I started falling in love with you the moment you said I was safe. No one had ever made me feel that way before, like I was truly protected, truly seen." Xavier turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "And I think I started falling in love with you the first time you opened those green eyes and looked at me like I was worth trusting." "We've built quite a life from that moment, haven't we?" Willow said, her voice thick with emotion as she gazed up at the man who had been her rock, her partner, her love for a quarter-century. "The best life," Xavier agreed. "And we're not done yet, Mrs. Zachary, not by a long shot." As they walked home hand in hand under a canopy of stars, both knew with absolute certainty that the promise made that day of safety, of belonging, of love had been not just kept, but exceeded in ways neither could have imagined. From a moment of crisis on a dusty train platform had grown a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. And in Silver Creek, folks would long tell the story of the pregnant widow who collapsed at the station and the cowboy who carried her to safety, and in doing so, found his own heart's home.